Hello, everyone, and welcome. We're going to give you all a chance to get your sound connected and get logged in. And once you do that, it would be wonderful if you would please introduce yourself in the chat. We would love to know where you're zooming in from, what's your Yale affiliation, and also what made you decide to join today's presentation. What's your interest in the topic today? So please do use the chat feature on Zoom to introduce yourself when you have a moment. That'd be very helpful. It's always nice for our presenters to see who's here in the Zoom room since they can't actually see you live and in person. So they will get a copy of this chat when it's over and they'll be able to see all of the introductions, all the wonderful introductions you all have provided. Hi to Leonard Horowitz in Florida. Esdras Styles, class of 73. Okay. I love it when folks shout out their residential college. And hi to James Corris, class of 72. And Catherine from Seattle, Yale College, class of 82. Saying hi to Ann Rose, who is class of 83. Interested in learning more about the implications of our country's new tariff initiatives, you've come to the right place. Anne. And hi to Tatiana, who is International Development and Economics, class of 98. This is wonderful. Please keep the introductions coming. I'm going to take a quick drink of water and I'll be right back. All right. It looks like we're all here. If you're just joining, we're asking everyone to introduce yourself in the chat and what's your Yale affiliation, what brought you here today. It's always helpful for our presenters to get to know the audience a little bit. And while you do that, I'm going to introduce our presenter, who is Professor Song Kim. He's Professor of Operations Management and Senior Associate Dean for Centers and Faculty Director of the Executive Programs at the Yale School of Management. Professor Kim specializes in supply chain management and service operations with a particular interest in management of business process failures. He develops analytical models based on operations, research, and game theory to study practice-driven problems. His recent research interests include managing low probability and high impact disruptions in supply chains, sustainable operations, and social responsibility in supply chain management. Using the risk management framework, he has studied problems in application areas such as aftermarkets in the aerospace and defense industry, environmental regulation, and social enterprises in developing economies. Professor Kim's research has been published in top management journals, and he currently serves as the associate editor at Management Science and Manufacturing and Service Operations Management. Professor Kim received his PhD in Operations and Information Management from the Wharton School at the University of Pennsylvania, and his MS in Scientific Computing and Computational Mathematics from Stanford University, and his BA was in Physics from the University of Pennsylvania. And Professor Kim is also going to speak to us about a program at the Yale School of Management, which we hope you will consider as an option for those of you who are interested. It's the Leading Business Model Innovation, which is an executive education program. And this program brings together experienced professionals from around the world who are ready to reimagine how their organizations create and capture value in today's rapidly changing landscape, which is one marked by technological breakthroughs and shifting customer expectations. This is a 5-day program, so it takes place on campus. It gives you an opportunity to come back to Yale's campus. There's classroom learning. It allows you to build meaningful connections with fellow leaders, navigating similar strategic challenges. And it's an opportunity for those who are interested to step back from daily operations, gain fresh perspectives, and develop actionable approaches to rethinking business models and ways to successfully implement change. So Professor Kim is going to touch on some of the themes from the Leading Business Model Innovation program during his presentation. And if you're curious to learn more, there's a team here in the chat who can answer questions. We will also have a Q&A discussion on any questions you might have. That's going to take place at the end of Professor Kim's presentation. So if you have questions, please do place them in the Q&A box. Welcome, everyone. We're so glad that you were able to join us today. I think we have quite an exciting presentation ahead of us. And with that, I will pass to Professor Kim to get us started.
Thank you so much for that nice introduction, Lauren. Hi, everyone. Again, as Lauren mentioned, my name is Sang Kim. I'm a professor at the School of Management. I saw on the chat box that actually a number of you are SOM alums, so I'm really glad to see all of you in many parts of the country and many parts of the world. So the topic of discussion today is what I do my research on, something that I've been interested in my professional life about supply chain resilience. I also saw in chat box that some of you actually work in supply chain functions and are interested in discussing the insights. I'm also equally interested in hearing from you. So although we're probably not going to have a chance to have a voice conversation here, but I'll be really interested in hearing what you're going through in terms of challenges in supply chains. So let me first share the presentation file that I prepared. Okay, hopefully everyone can see it. Lauren, could you verify that you can see this view?
We're seeing the version with your notes.
Uh, I'm sorry, say it again. Oh,
We're
okay, that is
seeing the
weird.
version with your notes, Professor Kim.
Okay,
There we go.
all right. All right,
Perfect.
yeah. Perks of using Zoom. All right. I mean, I was so accustomed to using Zoom when we were in COVID, but it's been a while. All right, great. So the title is Navigating Turbulent Times, Rethinking Supply Chain Resilience, and this is how I organize today's presentation. So I want to sort of go back in time and think about a lot of the challenges that we face in the world of supply chains during COVID. I'm going to bring up some examples, but that was really a watershed moment for professionals and academics in working in supply chains. And I'd like to sort of gather my thoughts about how I think about it, the whole experience that we went through. And then I'm going to try to characterize the shifting nature of supply chain risk. I think we're living in a time where the type of risk that we're facing in supply chains is quite different from what it used to be. This is my sort of attempt at collecting my thoughts on how to organize these new type of risk. So I'll bring that to you and also try to build some conceptual framework of how to build supply chain resilience facing this new type of risk that we're facing today. Great. So again, just very brief intro of myself, Professor of Operations Management. I also wear a hat as a Senior Associate Dean for Centers and Executive Programs. One of the things that I recently developed is the programs in business model innovation. And as Lauren mentioned, this program will have a start date of May 4th. So any of you who might be interested in joining this program, here's a QR code that will give more details about how to sign up, what kind of details are there. But really the topic of discussion for today is supply chains. All right. So let's try to dial back in time and think about all the things that happened during COVID and what kind of disruptions we faced in supply chains. So I'm talking about the times between 2020 and 2023, which was a really interesting time for me personally because, well, the topic of disruptions typically what's kind of unique about it is that everyone knows that this is something that is lurking underneath, but the conversation around disruption really don't bubble up too much unless there's something broken. And as a result of that, typically I'll do my own research in this subject, and I wouldn't get a lot of feedbacks of what I do normally. And then all of a sudden during COVID, I got a lot of requests from news media about can you comment on a shortage of one example that I remember actually was the shortage of hot dogs in concession stands in baseball stadiums. Although I didn't know much about hot dogs, I just based on my general knowledge, I was able to comment on some of those things. So it was an interesting time for me personally. And if I were to characterize what it was like in terms of supply chain disruptions during this COVID era, if I were to use a picture, it'll look something like this. All right, so this is the picture that comes up when I Google hot mess. And I think this is probably a very appropriate description of what we went through. So I know that some of you who are joining this meeting probably have your own personal and professional experience with the disruptions in supply chains. Now, obviously there are a lot of interesting stories that we heard at the time. All this fear of shortage of, the toilet papers, and also a lot of disruptions in the ports. This is a LA port where there's a long congestion, a long line of the vessels that were waiting to be docked at the LA port. Why that happened? Why? Because the workers at the dock and the truckers, they were quarantined and they could not show up to work. So all of these things were sort of converging at that time and really led to all these once in a lifetime of disruptions. And also another thing out of this experience was that, well, this was completely new to me, that the word supply chain and inflation could actually put together in one sentence. Now, I think there's more general awareness that the disruptions in supply chain could lead to a tremendous economic outcome. So this is a known knowledge now, but before that, people really didn't think too much of it. So it really was a moment where a lot of us really got this awareness that we're building on a supply chain that can really break easily. So let's again, based on that experience that we had a few years ago, what are the lessons that we got out of that experience? I would come up with three things. The first is there were a lot of surprising things that happened during COVID. So things that we thought were not possible actually turned out to be possible. And I'll give you some examples of this. And the second is the realization, and I personally knew about this, and many professions probably knew about this as well, but for the general public, this was a big surprise. We were sitting on a very fragile system of global supply chains. And the third is this is somewhat less pessimistic tone than these two others, is that despite all of these, I think the realization is that the system actually didn't collapse. So despite all of the ups and downs that we experienced during COVID, our system of global supply chains actually remained largely intact. So in some sense, there's that resilience built into the supply chain, despite the fact that, again, we had ups and downs. So that probably tells you something about how things were built, and there are a lot of thoughts that really went into the design of the supply chains, and largely it's been functioning pretty well. So if I were to go over a few things that I found quite surprising, things that we thought were not possible but actually happened. The first thing is the fact that the disruptions happen on both the supply and demand side. Now, there obviously have been a lot of disruptions before COVID. The one that is really cited a lot, again, pre-COVID, is the great earthquake that happened in Japan in 2011, which led to weeks of stoppages in, manufacturing of the cars, electronics. So that was a big moment in supply chains because all of a sudden people realized that these products that we enjoy, cars and electronics, they're all dependent on this fragile supply chain. And once one part of the linkage was broken, then the entire global supply chain became broken. But if you think about that example, it was really a disruption on the supply side only. Demand was still there. The disruption in supply side really led to all these, a shortage of the goods and, price increases and all that. But during COVID, what happened was there was a simultaneous disruption on both ends of supply and the demand side, which was, I actually never thought of that before, but it really happened. So I think that was probably one of the biggest surprises. The other is usually, again, we can think about that earthquake in Japan. Once a disruption happens, there's an expectation that we'll go back to normal. However long the disruption lasts, always an expectation that maybe we should wait a few weeks, maybe a few months, we'll go back to normal. But during COVID, that was just really difficult to forecast. That the COVID experience was more than 2, 3 years, and you probably remember this dreaded thought: when do we get out of this? I remember vividly having to, lecture in front of a Zoom in my basement, and it was not a fun experience. And it was just really hard to see where the end of the tunnel is. And in the business world, that was exactly the same thing. Once a variant of COVID hits a facility, there's a lockdown, and you're thinking, well, okay, so we're now out of it. But then there's another variant that starts, and not only this is happening within, the region that we're focused on, facility, or maybe in the U.S. It was just traveling all around the world, so it just became really difficult to see when we could actually get out of this. So I'll characterize this as prolonged, phased, and unlocalized disruptions. So unlike in many cases where if a disruption occurs, you apply a mitigation measure, and if you time it right, then the impact of disruption will go down. But during COVID, what happened was, while the disruption happens and is effective still there, another disruption occurs. And even if you're trying to mitigate the impact of this, you just automatically becomes late on this, and it just snowballs, and you lose an opportunity to contain this disruption impact. So this is what we saw during COVID. And at the same time, what I saw, this was talked about in the news media a lot, was that there's a paradigm shift in how to manage supply chains. You've probably heard this term too, just in case, what became sort of a new buzzword. People are saying that really the primary reason why we're experiencing this great disruption during COVID, was because of the prevalent practice of just-in-time manufacturing. Um, and people were speculating that this era is over. But now, as you probably also saw in the news media afterwards, um, a lot of the companies were actually going back to just in time now that COVID is over. So I don't really put a lot of weight into these type of conversations, because it seems like the narrative changes depending on where you are. Fact of the matter is, there is a reason why a lot of companies will practice just in time, because it is cost effective, it works. So I don't think it's a concept that's going to go away, but depending on the times in which you live, people will constantly talk about switching back and forth between just in time and just in case. That's my impression. Okay, so with all of that, let's think a little bit about the traditional playbook for building resilience into supply chains. These are talked about a lot among the practitioners, a lot of research papers on this topic as well. There's a set of tools that are used for building resilience in supply chains, and I would categorize many of them into these two buckets. The first is to invest in redundancy. Redundancy here meaning making copies of the assets. So it could be the final goods. So you basically make more of the final goods, put those into the inventories that you hold. And the inventory will serve as a buffer. The other very popular approach would be multi-sourcing. So you not only contract with one supplier, but multiple suppliers to make sure that if one supplier goes down, then another supplier is available for sourcing or for supplying the goods. So those are again redundancy, basically an idea of copying the goods and assets. The other would be investing in contingency, and this is slightly different from redundancy in a sense that, as the word contingency implies, what do you do after a disruption happens? Okay, so this is more of the strategies that you use after the fact. And for these, the idea of options flexibility comes to mind. You need to, like, for example, if disruption happens, rather than dedicating my access to multiple, say, suppliers, I could have a contractual relationship with certain suppliers so that the capacity is available only in emergencies. Now, you can think of a lot of complexities related to that kind of situation because that means you need to make sure that the supplier will have enough capacity only during emergencies, and you should have a very special contractual arrangement so that they actually have an incentive to keep that capacity for you. Um, and then, there are ideas like this is an old idea, but flexible manufacturing. If you have a manufacturing line, it's not used only to produce one type of product, but multiple types of products. So if you have that built-in flexibility in your manufacturing system, it could be used for contingency reasons. There are other, the tools that we can use, rationing, price adjustments, etc. But in a lot of cases, I think this investing in redundancy or investing in contingency, those are the two biggest way of thinking about how to build resiliency into the system. Okay, so those are the tools. And the other thing is how to think about the disruptions themselves. And this is a classical framework, sort of thinking about well, first of all, there are two questions. One is how likely is it to encounter a disruption? Now, depending on type of disruptions, the predictability or the probability will vary. Things like earthquake, these are the things that will happen once in a while, very difficult to predict when things will happen. So it's a low probability event. And then the other dimension that we have to think about is whether the consequence is light or severe, and so as a result, we get this 2 by 2 matrix. Now, when I present this 2 by 2 matrix to students in my classroom, and I ask, which of the four is the most challenging to address? And a lot of students will say, obviously, upper right corner, because that's the high disruption probability, severe consequences. So I can easily imagine that in terms of dollars, that's the most severe situation that we're going to encounter. But but then the other half of the class will raise their hands and say, no, that's not exactly right because you'd have much more difficulty with low probability, severe consequence of situation because with low probability, you basically don't have the historical data on which you can forecast when the disruption will happen. So you're in a bind. You just don't know exactly what's going to happen. You don't know the timing of the disruptions, yet you're going to encounter severe consequences. So things like earthquake actually could actually fit into that category. And I would actually agree with that those students that those are the most challenging ones to deal with. So this is again sort of a traditional framework to think about the nature of disruptions, and this framework has been in existence for decades, and this has sort of become a standard of how we categorize disruptions and what kind of tools we use in order to mitigate the impact of disruptions. Now, that being said, when COVID came along, and I was trying to think about where COVID would fit into that 2 by 2 matrix and found myself, it is actually challenging to put COVID into one of those four quadrants. One could argue that this is just a matter of magnitude. So, for example, if we were to compare chance of occurrence or consequences, instead of being rare or severe, we could say very rare and very severe. That was basically what COVID did to us because this was an occurrence once in a century kind of thing. But at the same time, there were some other dimensions that we had to consider, which I feel like it was just materially different. So these other dimensions I would add restoration outlook and chance of knock-on effects. So what do I mean by this? Restoration outlook, again, for earthquake, for example, the expectation is that once that happens, obviously there's a lot of loss of properties and potentially lives, but there's an expectation that people will work hard to restore the buildings and facilities and everything, and we'll go back to normal. with COVID, that was just really difficult to predict when we're going to get out of that. In part because we didn't know whether the vaccine would have been developed in time. So those type of uncertainties really kept us from guessing, were made us guessing. And when it comes to chance of knock-on effects, so this is things that I discussed before. Something happens in one facility and later there's another disruption in another facility, and those things are connected. There are knock-on effects. So those are the dimensions that I think became really need to things that need to be highlighted. Restoration outlook with COVID, somewhat predictable. I mean, we had a sense that we're going to come out at some point, but didn't know when. Chance of knock-on effects was really high. So these are, I think, the sort of the points of discussion becomes a little bit different compared to other types of disruptions that are out there. Now, let's turn the page from COVID. We're in a very different environment. Now, the memory of COVID has faded, but now we're dealing with this type of things, the new type of risk in terms of tariff, in terms of geopolitical risk that are really getting more and more prominent. And now it becomes really interesting. Now, I actually remember having a conversation with one of the sort of mid-sized company based in Connecticut, whose business was to import construction materials. And at that time, the CEO of this company had multiple factories in China and sourcing basically everything from China. Back in 2018, when there was first wave of tariffs that really got started, I remember asking this CEO, so now that tariff is going up, would you consider building a factory in the United States? And the answer to that was flat out no. There was no way that he was gonna do it because, well, not only are the things cheaper, the labor, materials, and everything is cheaper in China, but also the expertise in building these materials and putting everything together. No other place in the world can do that other than China. So in his mind, there was no way that he was going to do it. Well, fast forward a few years later, I got a chance to talk to him again. This was when we were sort of going out of COVID. And when I asked him, the answer was, well, we're building a factory in Pennsylvania. So that kind of explains the sort of change in the mindset of many people who are in this supply chain business. Now, so that was a few years ago. Now the trend is really accelerating. There was a time, maybe just a couple of years ago, when many companies were talking about China plus one strategy. Now is anything but China. There's basically a mass exodus out of China and try to build presence in places like Vietnam and other places. Um, and this seems real. A lot of companies are engaged in this, mass movement. So it is being materially being changed at the moment, and I think it's kind of an interesting time that we're witnessing right now. And at the same time, the narrative is is very complicated in the sense that depending on which company, which industry you're in, there are different effects that you might feel. And here, I'm contrasting one company to another, ASML and PepsiCo, both companies that I interacted with. And ASML, as you may know, is one of the biggest entities in the supply chain of semiconductors. And semiconductor industry is very unique because it's highly concentrated at every level of the supply chain. When it comes to chip manufacturing, there are only a few known entities: Samsung, TSML, Hynix. These are the companies who basically have a huge presence in chip manufacturing. But when it comes to the upstream, ASML is a big player because they provide the equipment for chip making. Um, so if you think about the structure of the supply chain for semiconductors, you can easily see that if something goes wrong in one part of the supply chain, the whole thing will go down. So there's that weakest link property in this particular supply chain. Whereas when I was talking with the managers at PepsiCo, again, because of the nature of the products that they sell, first of all, is very much diversified. a lot of the products. These are food products. And because of that reason, a lot of their manufacturing capabilities are scattered all around the world. And it became pretty apparent that PepsiCo is not the same as ASML. PepsiCo, in some sense, they have the structure that is more conducive to fending off the threats of tariff and all this regionalization because they already have that capability. So I think it is really important to remember that the impact of tariff and a lot of things that are going on these days, different industries will feel it quite differently. So, okay, so turning the page, related but somewhat different, is the new realities of how geopolitical risk is impacting supply chains. I have this picture over here. I actually grew up in the 80s, in an exciting time when globalization was just beginning. There's a lot of excitement about, for example, me being able to travel all around the world, have an opportunity to study in the US and all of those. I feel like we're going actually in an opposite direction these days. So this changing nature of geopolitical risk is something that the practitioners, the managers in supply chain are really aware of. And it is a little bit early in the game, but at the same time, I think it's important to point out some of the material difference that the geopolitical conflicts might give you in terms of quantifying the risk. So this is the same table that I showed you before, except that on the right-hand side, we have geopolitical conflict as one other element. So if I were to go over the same dimensions of chance of occurrence, consequences, restoration, outlook, and chances of knock-on effects, the my own description of how geopolitical conflicts differ from the risk coming from earthquake and pandemic are like this. So instead of saying the chance of occurrence of disruption is rare, very rare, I'll actually say it is accelerating, meaning that there is a movement. It's not just happening once in a while and then we wait until the next event happens, but rather there's a trend. So that's what I mean by accelerating. Um, and the other thing is the consequences. So instead of saying severe or very severe, I'll say potentially destabilizing. Okay. Outlook is highly unpredictable, and the chance of knock-on effects are very high. So if I were to list these words under the heading of geopolitical conflict, all of a sudden, I get the sense that this two by two matrix that I showed you before may not be as relevant as what it used to be. I feel like we actually need a new framework to think about how geopolitical conflict what kind of shape it will have when it comes to managing supply chains. All right. So with that is this related notion of systemic risk. When we talk about systemic risk, we usually think about the banking industry. So back in 2008, there was a great disruption in the financial industry. Bank runs and all of these things happen. But last year, when I and a few other professors in other schools formed a group, we actually engaged with the Department of Commerce because they were starting this new program they actually developed a tool called a scale tool, which served as a collection of data that will give you bird's eye view about what's going on in the global supply chain. And this tool was built, it was going online, and then January this year, the administration changed, so their direction is what it used to be before. We were not able to actually continue with this project, but that's the time when I first learned about the concept of systemic risk being applied to a supply chain context. So it's kind of an interesting exercise to go through is to compare the systemic risk in banking with supply chains. Well, in banking, so I'm guessing maybe some of you who are listening to this are in the banking or finance industries. Well, what are the features? Things like interconnectedness, opacity, bank runs, feedback loops. And the tools that are used for fending off, amplification of this risk is capital buffers, liquidity requirements. So these are some familiar terms. Now, Can we use similar tools in supply chains? I think there are some parallels. For example, if you think about capital buffers, uh, the inventories could actually serve that role. So there's that parallel. And then there are some others that we can make a generalization of. But at the same time, I think it's also very important to remind ourselves that the supply chains are very, very different from banking. First is, unlike in banking, there's a lot more physical constraints. The fact that we're talking about physical goods going from one place to another and making a decision around them, that is a constraint that we cannot do much about. And uh, and as a result of that, unlike in banking, where the interconnectedness leads to sort of very incomplete information on where things originate, in many cases, I would argue that the bottleneck was causing the delays could be readily identified in the supply chain, assuming you have enough information. Another is with supply chains, there's a built-in time delay, the lead times. If I order something, usually I expect things to arrive at my doorstep in a few days or in a few weeks, depending on what kind of goods you're talking about. This could slow down a recovery process, which is not a good thing. But then the good thing about the time delay is it could actually serve as a buffer. In banking, there tends to be, when there's bad thing happening, a catastrophic, collapse of the banking system cannot occur because information flow can be really, really fast. But when it comes to the physical goods, we're kind of, you know, okay on that respect because there's this built-in time delay that could actually serve as a buffer. So I think that's one big difference. And another really important difference with supply chains compared with banking is that unlike in banking, where there is a government entity who would have some say in terms of what the banks could do, in supply chains, by and large, is completely decentralized control. So there's no central authority who would say to the firms, you should do this, you should do that, or play any coordinating role. So I think this is probably the biggest issue that we have in the supply chain, is basically led by profit-oriented companies. And as a result, a lot of inefficiencies could come out of that setting. And then, if I were to think about the amplifier of systemic risk in supply chains, and this is a reality of the supply chain, the global supply chain that we've had over the many decades, is that the supply chain became longer and longer, meaning it's no longer a supply chain that's only within the United States or within China or other places, but it the tiers of supply chains that we're dealing with goes up to 10th tier, 11th tier. It just became longer and longer. And coinciding with that is it becomes extremely difficult to identify where the origin of disruption might actually occur. And we don't have great view about this. If you talk with the supply chain practitioners, they would say, yeah, of course, I know the entities of the suppliers that I directly interact with. But if I go to the second tier, I might have some ideas of who they are, but not completely. Third tier, fourth tier, they have no idea. So this is the big issue with supply chains, the opacity, the difficulty in identifying who I am sourcing things from. That will cause a lot of difficulties in managing the supply chains. Now, again, going back to the geopolitical risk, I emphasize this aspect that there are knock-on effects, there are unanticipated, difficult to foresee how things will emerge after disruption occurs. And this is one example of it. This is actually an old example. This is pre-COVID example, but I think it's worth thinking about what happened here. So there was a sort of a political spat between Japan and South Korea. This is, I think, yeah, back in 2018. Um, these are sort of rival countries, and historically there have been a lot of instances where, because of political reasons, despite the fact that there's a lot of integration of the supply chains in many industries between Japan and Korea, uh, there was a political decision that was made to say that um, the Japanese export to Korea for a key the chemicals that are used for chip making was banned. So back in 2018, there was a ban of these chemicals for making semiconductors, and it was a huge issue because companies like Samsung and Hynix at that time were importing 90% of this chemical from Japan. It was a very tightly integrated supply chain. And as a result of this, obviously, it was a big disruption for the industry. But what happened was neither Japanese government or Korean government could really have predicted is that um, this led to a sort of backlash, unanticipated consequences by which the companies in Korea basically developed their own way of manufacturing this hydrogen fluoride, and as a result of this, the companies that made this product before this dispute, their market share got shrunk. Um, these are I'm just highlighting this example as one example of a unintended consequences. These are things that are really extremely difficult to predict. When it happens, things unfold in unanticipated ways. And I think this is one important feature of the risk presented by geopolitics. So I'll give you more examples of this, but let me just summarize some of my own ideas of the distinctive characteristics of geopolitical risk. The first is the nature of it is persistent. Part of the reason is this is not a natural disaster. This is not something that happens exogenously and we react to it, but rather there are actors, the political leaders, others, who would actually make decisions in certain way that we're going into a certain direction. And as a result of that, resolution of that kind of acts will be really difficult. And the corollary to that is this notion of going back to normal is may not even apply. So what we started with, we're not going to go back to it, but the end state of this may be something quite different. So this is what I mean by persistent. And then the another word that I want to use for this is nonlinear. Okay, nonlinear meaning it is extremely difficult to predict the outcome of what we go through. And this is just an example of entanglement of events with separate origins, meaning that the event happened because of one reason, but because it takes a long time to resolve this, it gets entangled with another event, and the outcome can be extremely unpredictable. The other thing is, well, I just used the word unpredictable. So all of these three things are connected, but uh, basically the idea is that there's a very weak link between cause and effect, and the knock-on effects will be prevalent. So these are three words that I would use in order to describe the distinctive characteristics of geopolitical risk. And here's sort of my pictorial representation of the three different types of risk that I talked about so far. The first, I'll just use earthquake as an example. A natural disaster is an exogenous event, happens once in a while. I put this into this line. So again, the red arrows, they will represent the timing of the events. Happens once in a while. You make some efforts to restore from these disruptions. This is what I would describe as a COVID experience. The macro trend, there's a huge macro trend of, again, we're getting worse and worse in terms of dealing with COVID. And while this is going on, there are all sorts of disruptions that are happening in the world, closure of the facilities and other disruptions. And as the macro trend is going up, there's more prevalence of the disruptions in supply chains, and they can become entangled. But one point that I need to highlight here is with this COVID experience, we actually went back to normal. So after 2023, we're sort of back to normal of what we used to do. Obviously, there are some changes like, the elevation of the prices and all that. But with the geopolitical risk, I'll draw a picture like this. Very bumpy trajectory. And again, The black curve, they represent the macro trends, and along with it come all these disruptions. And also at the same time, the end result, what you see on the right-hand side is it is a state that's very different from the starting point. So in my mind, this is what's happening with the geopolitical risk. And the difficulty of that is if things get tangled up, and as things are more being connected, you might see the trend. We all know that there is a force of the nations are becoming more separated, and there's more effort to diversify the supply chain base and all that. We can see those trends, but what could emerge out of those trends? So I'm talking about the micro incidents that are emerging out of the macro trends. They become really unpredictable. So what I'm showing you here is the connected double pendulum. And as some of you have seen this type of picture before, it may give rise to a very chaotic result. So predictability becomes really, really difficult. And I feel like I need to actually bring up AI here because maybe some of you might have been wondering, but because we have this AI revolution that might help managing the disruptions and bring more resiliency. And I would agree with some parts of it, but not all. Because if you think about it, what AI does is, well, I mean, we use the word prediction machine for describing machine learning and AI technologies. And let's say, I have these data points that I accumulated. It looks like there's a trend. And if I were to use any machine learning or AI algorithm to predict where the next point is, I'll probably get, something quite similar to that, the last point over there. But, you could actually end up in a situation like this. The prediction is just completely different from what the end outcome is. What is this example? This is an example of balloon, the size of the balloon increasing and then it pops up. And this is actually an analogy of what happened during, for example, dot-com boom and bust. Uh, Everybody has an expectation that the boom will last, but then the bubble burst, and these things are extremely difficult to predict. So from that perspective, and just reminding ourselves that the machine learning and AI technologies, the algorithms are built based on the past experience and sort of predicting what the average outcome might look like in the future. I think we need to be a little careful about relying too much on those technologies. And also at the same time, relying on the sort of data-driven approach could also be quite dangerous because a lot of the trends that are happening, again, we might have a sense, but we don't know exactly what's going on underneath. And many of those may not be quantifiable as data. So this is sort of one danger of relying too much on AI and machine learning technologies is that everything has to be quantified. And if the unquantifiable information is missing, that automatically introduces a bias to the algorithm. And again, that could be an instance where we need to be really careful about trusting the output of those technologies. All right, so going back to this framework, this is the traditional framework that I talked about before, some common tools that have been used. And with all this sort of background about the new features of the geopolitical risk, I feel like, a new conceptual framework is needed. And before going there, let me talk about this a little bit. So we actually ran a survey among a few companies. We have about 8 companies here, asked them, what are you doing in this new sort of environment where tariff is going up, and geopolitical risk are rampant. And when we asked this question, they were filling out this form, we're doing this, we're doing that. And by just counting the checkboxes here, it looks like a lot of the companies are focusing on these areas. Footprint restructuring, meaning this is basically companies going out of China and putting facilities in Vietnam and other places, and also dual sourcing, which is exactly consistent with what we observe today. The supply chain becomes more diffused. There's a lot more basis of sourcing. Okay, now it's important to think about the pros and cons of this approach. As we go from the left to the right, So left is where our sourcing base is concentrated, and the right is our sourcing base is diffuse, is all over the place. Um, well, I mean, we have to sort of ask ourselves, why was it that most of the companies were just, single sourcing based in China? Because that was economically more viable. You want to take advantage of economies of scale by having all of your manufacturing supplies in one place. So this is a trade-off. As you go from the left to the right, you might actually build more resilience because your supplier base is more diverse, but at the same time, you're losing your economies of scale benefit. And this is something that a lot of companies are struggling with right now. They are forced to diversify their sourcing base at the moment, but at the same time, that is actually not helping them in terms of, cost containment. Um, we as consumers get to bear the brunt of it. But that's the reality. And then this new tariff regime really raises questions about if I'm looking at the multinational firm, what should I do? This is just a very quick peek at the current research that I'm working on right now. But it used to be that multinational companies would have one single production, region where everything is sourced, everything is produced, and then supplied to different markets. But now we're looking at a situation where this is what the current administration is really envisioning, that things are separated. But then the next question is for this multinational firm, is that optimal or is something like this better? So this is ongoing research. I've produced some interesting insights out of this, but not exactly a finished product yet. But we're basically living in a more complex situation today. All right. So here's sort of my own thoughts about how to think about the new approach to building resilience in the supply chain now that we all know that this is the new reality. And this is my pictorial representation of what it used to be. So traditional approach to mitigating the disruption in the supply chains. Now, I'd like to separate out the strategies that you put in place before an event happens and the strategies that you could apply after the event happens. So ex ante versus ex post, those are the terms that we use. So ex ante, in terms of preparedness, things like multi-sourcing, inventory stockpiling. So basically, you think about the possibilities of disruptions and put all of these things in place. And when it comes to response, things like expedited logistics or substitution or rationing, these are the typical tools that have been used. And again, this is under the assumption that the disruption is episodic, such as earthquakes. When we're dealing with a different type of disruptions, the nature that I described earlier, persistent, nonlinear, unpredictable, probably the same playbook. I mean, some of them could be still applied, but they're limiting. I think the mindset change is actually needed. So in terms of preparedness and response, I would say there should be more emphasis on building flexibility into the system. Why do I say it? Because if it is extremely difficult to predict the outcome, what the outcome might be, then investing a lot on forecasting and making a decision on that forecasting may not be the most productive way of putting your effort and money into. Maybe what you need to do is to amplify your ability to react after the fact, so ex post, what you can do about it. And that means we need to build more capability to be flexible. So this is different from sort of this duplication strategies of, contracting with multiple suppliers. I mean, that's one part of it, but don't put too much emphasis to it because you also want to think about how we can become more agile. So again, the idea is after an event happens, you want to address things more quickly. So flexible capacity, modular design, these are all about building capability to build flexibility into the system. So this is one of my messages. And also another thing is the end state will likely to be quite different from the starting state. And as a result, you want to think about more as an adaptation. It's not about going back to what it was before, but adapting to the new reality. So if I were to sort of describe what I just talked about, the message is it is important to develop a dynamic capability that will enable agile response. What are some practical examples of actually doing this? I mean, there are many examples historically, and then there are a lot of different innovations that you can come up with. The first, this is an old example actually, an innovation in processes. So it's an example from Benetton, one of the manufacturers of garments, t-shirts, and things like that. So what they did was a very simple tweak they made in the process. It used to be when they were making t-shirts, they were actually coloring the garments first, manufacture the sweaters, and then sell to the consumers. And what they found out was this is extremely inefficient. There's a lot of mismatch between the color preferences of the consumers and what they actually produce. So they ended up actually liquidating a lot of inventories of sweaters. So the innovation that they came up with was just simply switching the sequence of this. If they put the coloring as a last step in the process, you're closer to when the demand will be realized. You will have better information about the preference of the consumers and the match in terms of colors between the consumer taste and what they manufacture. It'll be better match. And as a result, you will have an enhanced system. So this is a simple tweak, but made a big difference for the company. Another way of innovation actually could be product design. So I'm just using these two examples to illustrate the idea of modular design. So modular meaning you standardize your design in such a way that you can mix and match things quickly. And IKEA is one example. This is an example from some years ago. It used to be that a lot of the laptops would have detachable battery, modular design. So this is one other idea. And the other thing is you can always come up with a new innovation in your business model. So this is an example of a company called Fictive. There are some other companies with a similar business model, but is unique in a sense that they basically, this is a cloud sourcing kind of arrangement for manufacturing. So they have relationship with contract manufacturers all around the world. And on demand, they can ask one of these suppliers to secure the capacity for building things for the customer. So this company is serving as a platform for that. And if you think about it, this will also bring agility to the system and also, a hedge against the current environment where tariff is going up everywhere. So this sort of leads to what I told you before about my new program in business model innovation, and this is one of the things that I'm going to talk about in that course, and sort of framework on how to think about business innovation, the different levers that we can pull. It could be redefining core offerings, reconfiguring linkages, restructuring governance, things like that. So a lot of those will be in that course. So those of you who are interested, I'll invite you to come to this. And then there are other challenges such as incentive alignment. Now, if it is the case that we're dealing with a very highly nonlinear environment with unpredictability, uh, and incentive alignment is a big issue everywhere, it just becomes even more challenging. This is based on my own research paper that I wrote a number of years ago. And the setting here is very similar to what we described before. There's a cascading disruption that affects multiple subsystems that makes up a system. And the question becomes, who's get to blame if there's simultaneous failure of the subsystems because of the cascading disruption? How do you actually shape the incentive for the firms to make sure that you restore the system as quickly as possible? Very difficult problem, and this paper highlights the big challenge in incentive alignment in that type of situation. And then another thing is, this is something I told you earlier about. In the world of supply chains, there's no central entity. Everything is decentralized. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't really think about a possible role of a government. And actually, one of them is, for example, during COVID, it was really difficult to source, healthcare products at that time. And if there was a centralized information flow as to where we could go, I think things would be much better. This Commerce Department effort was one part of this, although they were just supplying information to the companies. If the government had some say in what they could do, facilitating the imports, for example, that could actually make a difference. Obviously, it depends on what kind of product we're talking about, but things as important as healthcare products that actually could, uh, make sense. So it's something to think about. So I'll say with this new environment where geopolitical risk is becoming more and more prominent, I think the mindset is not so much about recovery. So we're not, trying to so much go back to what it used to be before, but rather adaptation, where you come up with a something different. And I think that having that mindset of continuous adaptation is probably what a lot of the practitioners want to keep in mind. Let me just skip through this thing really quickly here. And yeah, this is probably the final slide that I have. So this is going back to the survey result that I had before. A lot of the companies are putting a lot of effort for diversifying their supplier base, footprint restructuring, and dual sourcing. This is all natural. This is exactly the response that the companies should have. But at the same time, based on what I said earlier, the nature of the risk is quite different. Becomes more unpredictable, more nonlinear, and agility becomes even more important in this time. And as a result, I would argue that on top of these diversification efforts, you will want to also focus on these other things. And by the way, if you look at the check boxes here, the companies are actually not putting a lot of effort in this at the moment, but by streamlining processes, innovating the processes, and being more collaborative with the partners in the supply chains. These are the ways in which you can enhance your agility in the system. And I strongly believe that this should also be a big effort that the companies should make on top of the diversification effort. All right, so quick summary. Uh, the nature of geopolitical risk that's imposed on supply chain, there's a qualitative difference. These are persistent, nonlinear, and unpredictable characteristics that we're dealing with. And one big message that I have is that it is important to shift focus from ex ante commitment to ex post agility, meaning that you want to or you want to develop dynamic capabilities that will actually create flexibility in the system. And finally, reframe the mindset from recovery to continuous adaptation. So that's my final message to this. And if you have any comments, ideas, or stories that you want to share, this is my email. I'll be really glad to be connected with you about this. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you, Professor Kim. I'm trying to restart my video. There we go. Thank you so much for that presentation. Very thorough and comprehensive. You covered a lot of my questions, actually. So I was making notes and questions as you were going, and then you would hit my question right at the next slide. So you really covered so much ground. Thank you so much for that. For those who have questions, we do have some time for Q&A. So if you have questions, please do place your questions in the Q&A box and not in the chat. It's just easier to find the questions when they're in the Q&A box, and I can make sure that I've covered all of them. I want to start with Tatiana's question. Tatiana says, spending much of 2024 in Ukraine, I have seen how Ukrainians had to be very agile in their supply chain. Have you talked to any Ukrainian companies as part of your research?
Great question. I'd like to. I haven't had a chance yet. And this is also tied to another interest of mine, and this is, um, Ukraine is because of the experience that the country had over the last few years, has become a big innovator in defense and defense related products such as drones and the capabilities that they have built. And probably there are supply chain issues associated with it, I can imagine. So I'd actually love a chance to be connected with Ukrainian companies. I just haven't had a chance.
Well, you identify defense as one of the major industries that would be impacted in Ukraine. I wonder if you have any other thoughts on key industries that we should look to when we think about how the conflict in Ukraine is disrupting supply chains.
Yeah, no, so defense is one area, but so tariff and geopolitical risk, I guess one other characteristics is that this is really disrupting many industries, all industries that are out there. Just the other day I was talking with somebody who worked in a retail sector. So this is an experience of a tariff. So this is a company based in New York that um, you know sources the sweater products and sell to customers like Walmart, TJ Maxx, etc. So this is not a high-end product, but more of a mid-end, low-end type of product. And this company is just greatly disrupted by tariff, as you can imagine. So what they did earlier this year was that they tried to diversify their source. They were contacting potential suppliers in other parts of the world. They had a contract. They actually sourced some of the products, and then found out that this is not exactly scalable. The quality and the expertise that the suppliers would provide was just not exactly there. So they actually ended up going back to China, despite that the tariff has gone up. And then I heard another story, which was almost the opposite of that. This was a much bigger company in a retail sector, and they actually, even before the new tariff came into place, they were sort of anticipating that this will happen, and they put a lot of time and energy to diversify their supply chains, and they're doing better. So I think it's a question of how big your company is, which industry you're in. Everyone's trying to adapt, but in a very different ways.
Wonderful insights. Thank you for that. We have a question in the chat. Let me see if I can find it here. George is asking if you have any prediction about how the Supreme Court will rule on the legality of the tariffs.
That's an excellent question. So, you know,
I'd also like to know if you have a crystal ball.
Well, obviously I don't. I guess there have been reports that depending on the question that the judges were asking, there is a chance that this actually could be reverted. Who knows? I guess we'll have to wait a little bit. But I think this is one danger of companies jumping to diversify their supplier base because, well, it's a commitment. One thing about diversification is once you start doing it, it's really hard to revert. You have a contract with all suppliers all over the world. Rewinding that could be quite costly. And as a result, I can foresee a scenario where Supreme Court rules that this is basically illegal. The companies will have to be reimbursed by this, and it's going to be a change. And I think it also explains some of the hesitations that many companies have faced. Should do this or not? The sense that I got was a lot of the companies were sort of looking at what the competitors are doing and, not, making sure that they're not sort of moving too much ahead. So I definitely saw that hesitation.
I wonder if we can think for a minute about the finance side of this. I mean, it would seem to me that if you have sort of longstanding supplier relationships,
Hmm.
you have some sort of financial relationships built into your business model that may
Hmm.
not be viable in the same way when you have to diversify.
Yeah, no, I think everything changes. This is not just about shipping things and, how many suppliers I have. Uh, I actually talked about this trade-off earlier, but the expectation is with the diversification, your cost will go up. So if that's the case, what do companies do? I mean, one obvious thing is to raise price for the consumers, but at the same time, you don't want to transfer all the cost increase to the consumers. So that means they need to make things more efficient in their supply chains. I mean, agility comes into place in this conversation as well. So that means you basically need to restructure your supply chain as a whole. It's not just about multiplying the number of the suppliers. The finance come right after that, right? So if I have more diversified supplier base, um, so one big aspect of that is we basically have many copies of the same thing, and that increase inefficiency. And your financial statement will look less attractive compared to what it used to be before. So yeah, that'll make a lot of adjustment that the company, the CEOs and others should really think about.
But even and I'm thinking particularly about small business because I mean,
Oh,
this conversation happens, I think, in the media very much looking at large businesses, but
sure.
um, the U.S. economy is built on the back of small business, right?
Hmm.
And there are so many small businesses that are struggling now
Yeah.
because of the cost of doing
Hmm.
business. So
Hmm.
for them, diversifying suppliers, even if they are able to do that, or building agility
Hmm.
into their systems,
Hmm.
has a cost in terms of how to develop
Yeah,
that. Then
definitely.
a second cost in
Yeah,
terms of, now I have two suppliers that I've got to raise deposits for.
right.
And I don't have the same kind of credit profile with the new
Mhm.
supplier as I had with the old supplier. Like if you could speak to small business and how they deal with those issues.
Good point. And I think this comes goes directly into the narrative of K-shaped economy that we often talk about. I mean, we talk about K-shaped economy from mostly from a consumer perspective, and I think it equally applies to businesses as well. So if you think about again multi-sourcing diversification, large companies are able to handle this much better than the small companies. I've seen recent statistics of a lot of small businesses are actually going out of business these days. Um, presumably because they don't really have the capability to what similar to what other large companies are doing. So they're really boxed in. And it's an unfortunate situation. I don't have any crystal ball or good ways of emerging out of this. Hopefully, the Supreme Court decision comes in certain ways to help those businesses.
Well, we'll have to improve the supply chain for sourcing crystal balls. That
Yeah.
would be very helpful.
Yeah.
Um, there are a couple of questions that we have here that have come in. Esther, I'm not sure, Esther, if you meant for this to be phrased as a question, but Esther says, is there no opportunity now to prevent supply chain collapse because of geopolitical events?
Yeah, so I mentioned this earlier just briefly, but one big surprise to me after COVID episode was that most of the system that we have in place actually remain largely intact. So I actually believe in built-in resilience of the supply chains. The question really becomes, will that level of resilience be more or less as we go into this new era of more diversified supply chains? So, just theoretically speaking, if things are more diversified, that means your risk is more spread around. And as a result, you could argue that the resilience is stronger with the diversified supply chains. But at the same time, there could be counter argument. Well, what does diversification mean? It doesn't mean we're actually reaching out to the suppliers that are not exactly trusted. Maybe there are quality concerns or environmental concerns and all those things. And if a risk starts from one of those, then it could actually propagate the disruptions even faster. So I think there are two sides to this, and it's a little hard to predict which might emerge more. I mean, I guess first, my prediction or my sort of own conjecture here is that the first order effect is more diversified means more resiliency, but at the same time, there could be some unexpected outcomes because of the reasons that I told you.
Okay, let's go to Jamie's question. Jamie says, can you discuss what the implications are to local economies with diversification?
When you say local economy, are you talking about the economies in the US?
I don't have clarity on that,
Mhm.
but I would
Okay.
say,
Mhm.
yeah, thinking about local and regional
Right.
economies in the US.
Yeah, no, I said earlier that I'm working on a research. This is an economic model, mathematical model that has pricing decision, inventory decision, capacity decision when a multinational firm has presence in two or more countries. So this research actually addresses exactly that issue. what happens if tariff barrier goes up? I was actually hoping that I could find some surprise with respect to what might happen in the US out of that model, but there was actually no surprise. And the outcome or the prediction of the model was that, well, price will go up. There will be less items that are available, and basically the consumers will suffer more. So it's not exactly a very, I guess, optimistic outcome. But I think that's probably what's going to happen. And I think we're sort of experiencing this. This person that I talked to, this apparel company based in New York, um, I had this suspicion, and she confirmed it, and that is up until as of last week, say Thanksgiving holiday, because there was a big discount. This company was making sure that the price doesn't go up substantially because of competitive reasons, but they're planning to jack up the price after the holidays. So that's coming.
Oh, yeah. And I wonder, sort of as a follow-on to that, if there's a scenario of agility for companies that are based outside of the US to just sort of cut the US market out of their
That's a
uh,
possibility. Yeah, I think that's a real possibility. I think we're still relatively early in, how, where we're moving. So whether that happens or not, but, for a few years now, there have been conversation about, China and US, they're competing, and at the same time they're developing their own capabilities when it comes to AI and critical technologies. So if this technological disentanglement happens, what does it mean for the world? So it'll be interesting to watch how that develops.
Yeah, we've seen it on the defense front, right? Like
Mhm.
Europe
Right.
had sort of organized itself to exist in a world that doesn't have the US as part of their equation. And
Yeah.
people are wondering, how does that happen with the kinds of things happening in the supply chain and the tariffs?
Yeah.
Does that just sort of knock the US off as a
Yeah.
consumer market
I,
altogether?
I think again that's I think that's a real possibility.
Yeah.
If, for example, as a reaction to the tariff going up, China decide in certain part of their supply chains, depending on which industry you're in, might say, we'll cut off the U.S., but instead we might expand our business to other regions. I think that's a real possibility.
Yeah, very, very interesting point. Okay, we have a question. Is there a geopolitical component to any potential solutions to geopolitical disruptions? What I mean by that is fighting fire with fire. For example, increasing lobbying investments.
Yeah, that's a good question. It's something that I haven't really thought about, maybe because I was focusing so much about how to build resilience in the supply chain perspective. But yeah, I mean, if there are political reasons as to why things happen, there could also be political resolution to it. It's really difficult. I mean, I feel like we're still at the sort of, uh, you know, increasing part of the curve rather than being stabilized or decreasing. So at least for the foreseeable X number of years from now, I can only see that things will actually get worse before it gets better. So yeah, I mean, it's something that I think a lot of us will hope that will be a factor going forward, but I guess I'm not really banking on it to be happening in the near future.
Okay, and Jamie has come back with another question. We've talked about the consumer side, but what about the production side, the impact to
Mhm.
employees and labor markets?
Yeah, such a great question. So, I mean, the really the biggest reason as to why the tariffs started going up was this idea that we need to bring manufacturing back to the U.S. Um, and I can definitely agree with the sort of the end goal of it. But what I don't completely agree with is that this is not just flipping a switch. It's not going to happen overnight. Building a factory takes 3, 4 years at least. And also, the big issue is that in the US currently, in a lot of sectors, we just don't have the expertise to, plug people in and building stuff. That'll take time. And because of economic reasons, for example, labor cost is much higher in the US compared with other nations. There's only so much that can be done, is the sense. And I think if I were to sort of design this tariff policy, I would actually focus on certain industries and sectors. Semiconductor, we're already doing it. Actually, I think that's a good area to explore because it's not just a consumer product that we're making. It's more of a B2B market. There are different qualities to it. Um, for consumer products, auto, for example, I'm not exactly sure. It is actually, a good idea to put all the energy to bring everything back. Um, but, it's just my opinion.
Okay, wonderful. There were two questions in the chat that I think I can get back to. Stanley asked, does it make a difference to the analysis whether a disruption happens from natural forces or occurs because a rival chooses to cut off supply?
That's a really interesting question. So yeah, a lot of the examples that I focused on are assuming there's some exogenous event that will really provide a shock to the system. But I think what you're talking about, the endogenous, sort of in some sense, willful act of breaking the supply chains. Actually, now that I think about it, I actually addressed that in the research paper that I showed you earlier. So the question there was if there's exogenous shock that's affecting more than one subsystem in a system, and if one of those subsystem provider has a ability to affect whether the disruption will cascade to the other subsystem or not. How does it influence the outcome? And actually, one interesting finding that I have in this analysis was that there is actually increased incentive for a subsystem provider to let the propagation go through. So meaning let the other fail more often. Um, and I guess I'm not going to go into the fine details of that result, but that was an interesting finding, and this is all tied to the incentive. Basically, if I were to sort of summarize the intuition behind that, um, if it is the case that there are two subsystems that are failing the entire system, um, the one who's originating the failure of the system basically want to blame the other, sort of, basically in the same boat. So that's kind of a very short summary of my finding.
I know we have two readings that you've shared with us that are available on our website for this. We have a website page dedicated to this presentation,
Mhm.
and we have a New York Times article and a Yale Insights article called "Supply Chains Need to Become More Agile in an Age of Tariffs."
Mhm.
We may link some of the research pieces as well for those who want to follow up by reading that if it's been published.
Right. The Yale Insight piece is actually a very short summary of what I talked about today.
Okay.
The New York Times piece was just one example of many, many articles that are being published these days about supply chain disruption. So I don't consider it as a comprehensive references, but there you can find a lot of news article wise. I mean, there's just so many of it these days. I'm sure you can find many examples, but yeah, that there are a lot of resources that are out there.
Great. I want to give the last couple of minutes to you to talk about the Leading Business Innovation Program at YSM and see if there's anything that you want to share with folks. I know that people have an opportunity to apply to this program to come to Yale's campus and be in a residential program for 5 days and focus on rethinking your organization's business model and creating organizational structures that support innovation. And so, before we close out here, I'd love to kind of give the floor to you to say anything about applying to that program and encouraging people to find out more about it.
Yeah, thanks for giving me that opportunity. Yeah, so this is again a new program, open enrollment program that we're studying, scheduled for May. I'm the faculty director of that program. And here we're going to have an opportunity for kind of a mix of discussions and exercises and all of those for those who are thinking about reinventing your organization, or if somebody is interested in starting a new company, what is the right way to approach innovation in business models? We'll try to bring up a lot of examples that have been documented, go through the exercise of trying to build a new enterprise or reinventing the organization from It could be the fact, actually, I use this example all the time, but the education industry has been disrupted substantially. So what do you do in that environment? Do you want to come up with the different ideas of the stakeholder engagement and what kind of new methods that we develop? So you will have a chance to not only listen to the experts on how we think about these issues, but also encounter examples and try to come up with your own design of the business model. So that's about the whole program. It's a 5 day residential program. If there's participation by the alums, I think that'll really, really enrich the experience for everyone. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Professor Kim. We really appreciate your time and your presentation today. Wonderful opportunity for us to become educated on a very important issue that's touching all of us, whether we're in the supply chain, in the flow of issues of the supply chain or not. So I really appreciate your time and your presentation. And this will be available on the Yale Alumni Academy website for those who had to leave early. So we will make it available on demand. And we look forward to seeing all of you on the next Alumni Academy presentation. Thank you so much, Professor Kim.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye. Bye.